Welcome everybody to Chapter 4 of Animal Farm. We are on page 54, as you can tell at the bottom there. 5-4, so that's where you need to be. Now, just to back up a little bit, if we were to thumb backwards, some of the things you'd remember were that they got rid of the worthless parasitical human beings. They had a very, very good harvest. Sundays became this day to celebrate and so on and so forth. Okay. Let's see. The cat even got involved and tried to eat a few birds. We've got Napoleon and Snowball, which are kind of starting to butt heads, and Napoleon himself takes over education of the puppies for some reason that we find out a little bit later on. Excuse me. When the animals started to ask questions, remember a squealer that swooped in and said things like, "Careful, you don't want Jones to come back." We pigs are the brain workers using all of his propaganda. So that takes us to Chapter IV, Chapter 5, and that's found on page 54. Okay? Well, here we go. Remember, the idea is for you to follow along in your book, not necessarily up on the screen. It might be difficult to see. I'll tell some jokes, tie some things in, but overall, make sure that you're keeping track in your book. Okay? So here we go. By the late summer, the news of what had happened on Animal Farm had spread across half the county. Every day, Snowball and Napoleon sent out flights of pigeons. Now, you've noticed I've underlined that. They sent out flights of pigeons. Flights of pigeons whose instructions were to mingle with the animals on neighboring farms, tell them the story of the rebellion, and teach them the tune of Beasts of England. That's interesting that Animal Farm actually wants this to spread to other animals. Now, you could compare that a lot to what was going on in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was one of the first communist countries. And the idea was, Marx's idea wasn't just, happiness and fairness for just Soviet workers, but really his idea was for all. And so the idea was to spread communism. And that's kind of what's going on here. Is you have Animal Farm that is trying very, very hard through the pigeons to spread communism. Sorry, spread animalism. And in real life, we know that's about the Soviet Union spreading communism. All right. Most of the time, Mr. Jones had spent sitting in the tap room of the Red Lion at Willingdon, complaining to anyone who would listen of the monstrous injustice he had suffered in being turned out of his property by a pack of good-for-nothing animals. The other farmers sympathized in principle, but they did not at first give him much help. At heart, each of them was secretly wondering whether he could not somehow turn Jones's misfortune to his own advantage. Oh, how sad. They want to take advantage of each other. It was lucky that the owners of the two farms which adjoined Animal Farm were on permanently bad terms. So this is what we'll say that this marker right here represents Animal Farm. The farms on either side, okay, they don't like each other. And that's good news for Jones, okay? Otherwise, they'd probably be teaming up against Animal Farm and try and take over the farm. But something different is going to happen, okay? Back to the farms. Find where it says one of them, just at the bottom, okay? Here we go. One of them, which was named Foxwood. What a great name for a farm. Foxwood was a large, neglected, old-fashioned farm, much overgrown by woodland, with all of its pastures worn out and its hedges in disgraceful condition. So kind of a lazy farm. Its owner, Mr. Pilkington, underline that. Pilkington was an easygoing gentleman farmer who spent most of his time in fishing or hunting according to the season. Now, did you catch that? I bet we can figure out who this represents. Foxwood. Mr. Pilkington. Think of countries that weren't too far from the Soviet Union, okay? Countries that weren't too far from the Soviet Union that fit this description of the time period. Foxwood, kind of lazy, not doing the best. We're pretty sure that this represents people like Churchill and England, Great Britain. Now think of Foxwood, somebody who hunts foxes. Remember those old cartoon movies where they go on the horses and chase around the foxes? That's kind of an English saying. That's how you can remember. Foxwood. Pilkington from Foxwood represents England and Churchill. Now, I bet after that you can figure out who this next one is. Next page, we have the other farm on the other side. Find the other farm. It's at the top of the page. All right? The other farm, which was called Pinchfield, was smaller and better kept. Its owner was a Mr. Friedrich, a tough, shrewd man, perpetually involved in lawsuits, and with a name for driving hard bargains. These two disliked each other so much that it was difficult for them to come to any agreement, even in defense of their own interests. Did you catch that? Any guesses? Pinchfield, shrewd, always stirring up trouble. Oh, check out the name. Friedrich. Now, Foxwood sounded English. Friedrich sounds what? German. This is most likely Germany. Hitler's Nazi Germany. Okay? So again, we've got two farms on either side of Animal Farm. You need to be able to tell what they are, okay, describe them, and how those kind of match up with Germany and Britain, Great Britain at the time. Great Britain, we already said, is another term for England. All right. Nevertheless, they were both thoroughly frightened by the rebellion on Animal Farm and very anxious to prevent their own animals from learning too much about it. At first, they pretended to laugh, to scorn the idea of animals managing a farm for themselves. The whole thing would be over in a fortnight, they said. Now, I underline over in a fortnight. Any idea what that means? Go back and reread that. Over in a fortnight. Phrase that means won't be too long until it's done. Over in a fortnight. They put it about that the animals on Manor Farm, in parentheses it says, they insisted on calling it the Manor Farm, they would not tolerate the name Animal Farm, were perpetually fighting among themselves and were rapidly starving to death. Interesting, they're starting to spread these lies about Animal Farm. When time passed and the animals had evidently not starved to death, Frederick and Pilkington changed their tune and began to talk of the terrible wickedness that now flourished on Animal Farm. It was given out that the animals were practiced cannibalism, tortured one another with red-hot horseshoes, and had their females in common. This was what came of rebelling against the laws of nature, Friedrich and Pilkington said. Wow, so they really want to make Animal Farm look bad. Bottom now. However, these stories were never fully believed. Rumors of a wonderful farm where the human beings had been turned out and the animals managed their own affairs continued to circulate in vague and distorted forms. Next page. And throughout that year, a wave of rebelliousness ran through the countryside. So the other animals in other farms start to catch on. Check this out. Bulls, which had always been tractable, suddenly turned savage. Sheep broke down hedges and devoured the clover. Cows kicked over the pail. Hunters refused their fences and shot their riders onto the other side. Now, hunters doesn't mean hunters like you or I know. Probably horses that are used for hunting. So check that out. The bulls, the sheep, the cows, even the horses that are used for hunting, all of them are turning against their owners. Above all, the tune and even the words of Beasts of England were known everywhere. It had been spread with astonishing speed. The human beings could not contain their rage when they had heard this song, though they pretended to think it merely ridiculous. They could not understand, they said, how even animals could bring themselves to sing such contemptible rubbish. Oh, good phrase. Underline that. Contemptible rubbish. Rubbish, we know, is another word for trash. Contemptible means something you really don't like. So they compare the song to trash that we really don't like. Contemptible rubbish. Any animal caught singing it was given a flogging on the spot. That means they beat him great. Beat him really, really badly. And yet the song was irrepressible. The blackbirds whistled it in the hedges. The pigeons cooed it in the elms. It got into the din of the smithies and the tune of the church bells. And when the human beings listened to it, they secretly trembled, hearing in it a prophecy of their own future doom. Okay. Early in October, when the corn was cut and stacked, and some of it was already threshed, a flight of pigeons came whirling through the air and alighted into the yard of Animal Farm in the wildest excitement. Jones and all his men, with half a dozen others from Foxwood and Pinchfield, had entered the 5-barred gate and were coming up the cart track that led to the farm. They were all carrying sticks, except Jones, who was marching ahead with a gun in his hands. Obviously, they were going to attempt the recapture of the farm. Sorry, I messed that up. Okay, last line on page 56. This had long been expected, and all preparations had been made. Snowball, who had studied an old book of Julius Caesar's campaigns, which he had found in the farm, was in charge of defensive operations. He gave his orders quickly, and in a couple minutes, every animal was at his post. Okay, so if you go back and look at that, I have Julius Caesar marked. Julius Caesar would have been a famous general / strategist who would have written books, and so it's a good thing Snowball knows how to read. He studied how to fight battles, and here is his plan. Prepare yourself. As the human beings approached the farm buildings, Snowball launched his first attack. All the pigeons, to the number of 35, flew to and fro over the men's heads and muted upon them from midair. And while the men were dealing with this, the geese, who had been hiding behind the hedge, rushed out and pecked viciously at the calves of their legs. Now, you might not think geese are terrifying. Mr. Chandler is terrified of them. He has been attacked by geese on more than one occasion, and I hate them. Next part. However, this was only a light skirmishing maneuver, intended to create a little disorder, and the men easily drove the geese off with their sticks. Snowball now launched his second line of attack. Muriel, Benjamin, and all the sheep, with Snowball at the head of them, rushed forward and prodded and butted the men from every side, while Benjamin turned around and lashed at them with his small hoofs. But once again the men, with their sticks and their hobnailed boots, were too strong for them, and suddenly at a squeal from Snowball, which was the signal for retreat, all the animals turned and fled through the gateway into the yard. And I think that's interesting. We talk to you often about using transitions, and here, as we're going through the battle, the author does a good job with transitions. First part of the attack. Second, finally, so be sure and use those in your own writing as well. All right, so remember, the men have driven the animals back, but it sounds like that's part of the plan. The men gave a shout of triumph. They saw, as they imagined, their enemies in flight, and they rushed after them in disorder. This was just what Snowball had intended. As soon as they were well inside the yard, the 3 horses, the 3 cows, and the rest of the pigs who had been lying in ambush in the cowshed suddenly emerged in their rear, cutting them off. Snowball now gave the signal for the, turn the page, for the charge. He himself dashed straight for Jones. Jones saw him coming, raised his gun, and fired. The pellets scored bloody streaks along Snowball's back, and a sheep dropped dead. Oh, how sad. Without halting for an instant, Snowball flung his 15 stone against Jones's legs. Now, for that to make sense, you'll probably need to figure out what 15 stone means. Any guesses? It says Snowball flung his 15 stone against Jones's legs. See if you can figure that out before our next discussion. Jones was hurled into a pile of dung, and his gun flew out of his hands. That's funny. Oh, crap. He ended up in the dung. With the most terrifying spectacle of all... I'm messing up. But the most terrifying spectacle of all was Boxer, rearing up on his hind legs and striking out with his great iron-shod hoofs like a stallion. His very first blow took a stable lad from Foxwood on the skull and stretched him lifeless in the mud. Underline that, lifeless. He's without life, laying in the mud. At that sight, several men dropped their sticks and tried to run. Panic overtook them, and the next moment all the animals together were chasing them around and round in the yard. They were gored, kicked, bitten, trampled on. There was not an animal on the farm that did not take vengeance on them after his own fashion. Even the cat suddenly leapt off a roof onto a cowman's shoulders and sank her claws in his neck, at which he yelled horribly. At a moment when the opening was clear, the men were glad enough to rush out of the yard and make a bolt for the main road. And so within 5 minutes of their invasion, they were in ignominious retreat by the same way as they had come, with a flock of geese hissing after them and pecking at their calves all the way. How do you like that? They drove him off again. Now remember it said he was lifeless, right? The Boxer had knocked this guy out. Let's keep going. All the men were gone except one. Back in the yard, Boxer was pawing with his hoof at the stable lad who lay face down in the mud, trying to turn him over. The boy did not stir. "He is dead," said Boxer sorrowfully. "I had no intention of doing that. I forgot that I was wearing iron shoes." Top of the next page. "Who will believe that I did not do this on purpose?" "No sentimentality, comrade," cried Snowball, from whose wounds the blood was still dripping. "War is war. The only good human being is a dead one." "I have no wish to take a life, not even a human life," repeated Boxer, and his eyes were full of tears. "Where's Molly?" exclaimed somebody. Molly, in fact, was missing. For a moment there was great alarm. It was feared that the men might have harmed her in some way, or even carried her off with them. In the end, however, she was found hiding in her stall, with her head buried among the hay in the manger. She had taken to flight. Oh, interesting phrase there. She had taken to flight as soon as the gun went off. Any guesses what taken to flight means? That's right, it means she ran off. And when the others came back from looking for her, it was to find that the stable lad, who was in fact only stunned, had already recovered and made off. So it said he was lifeless, but he was only stunned. He's okay, folks. Don't worry about it. The animals had now reassembled in the wildest excitement, each recounting his own exploits in the battle at the top of his voice. So they're like, "Yeah, I took out this guy, and I did this." You've got it. An impromptu celebration of the victory was held immediately. The flag was run up, and Beasts of England was sung a number of times. Then the sheep who had been killed was given a solemn funeral, a hawthorn bush being planted on her grave. At the graveside, Snowball made a little speech, emphasizing the need for all animals to be ready to die for Animal Farm if need be. The animals decided unanimously to create a military decoration, Animal Hero First Class, which was conferred there and then on Snowball. They gave him a medal. And Boxer. It consisted of a brass medal. They were really some old horse brasses which had been found in the harness room, to be worn on Sundays and holidays. There was also Animal Hero Second Class, which was conferred posthumously on the sheep. Now, posthumously means what? When you give something to somebody when they die. So let's say that, I met a teacher who was studying at college, and the teacher got really, really sick and died before they're actually able to finish the program. So they awarded that teacher, that student in that case, a degree posthumously. So they gave it to him after they died. So they give the dead sheep an award. There was much discussion as to what the battle should be called. In the end, it was named Battle of the Cowshed, since that was where the ambush had been sprung. Mr. Jones' gun had been found lying in the mud, and it was known that there was a supply of cartridges in the farmhouse. It was decided to set the gun up at the foot of the flagstaff like a piece of artillery and fire it twice a year, once on October the 12th, the anniversary of the Battle of Cowshed, and once on Midsummer Day, the anniversary of the rebellion. Now, your job, folks, is also to read chapter 5 on your own. What you're going to look for, amongst other things, is what happens to Molly. You need to remember that Molly represents the bourgeoisie. You have several questions about chapter 4 and chapter 5, and those are all due. But overall, enjoy chapter 5 of Animal Farm.